The young soldier walked into an old pawn shop, holding a tarnished silver medal. "I need money urgently," he said. But when the elderly owner took the medal and saw the name engraved on the back, her face went pale. 10 minutes later, she emerged from the back room, holding a yellowed photograph, tears streaming down her face. "This is the man who saved my life. I don't want anyone to be left behind. Everyone deserves to be remembered and valued. If you believe this too, comment respect. To show you stand for gratitude and justice." Eric Walker stood outside the pawn shop, his fingers tightening around the small velvet pouch in his pocket. Rain pelted the cracked sidewalk, matching his mood as he stared at the faded sign. At 32, the former Army infantryman never imagined he'd be here, about to sell the only thing of value he had left. 2 weeks without work, 3 rejection letters, rent due in 3 days. He pushed open the door, triggering a gentle bell chime. The shop was cluttered, but meticulously organized. Glass cases displaying watches and jewelry, walls lined with musical instruments, shelves stacked with antique curiosities. Behind the counter stood Margaret Pierce, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined a pocket watch. "Be with you in a moment," she said without looking up, her voice carrying the warm authority of her 70-plus years. Eric nodded, though she couldn't see him. He wandered the shop, postponing the inevitable. His fingers traced the edge of a display case containing military memorabilia, medals, insignia, old dog tags. The irony wasn't lost on him. Afghanistan had left him with scars, both visible and hidden. The visible ones had healed. The others, well, those were why he couldn't hold a job for more than a few months. The VA had denied his benefits. Claim, some paperwork issue they kept promising to resolve. 6 months of bureaucratic circles later, his savings had evaporated. "What can I help you with today?" Margaret asked, finally looking up. Eric approached the counter, his steps heavy. "I need to sell something. That's generally why people come in," she replied with a gentle smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Years of running a pawn shop had taught her to recognize desperation. Eric's hand trembled slightly as he withdrew the velvet pouch. It was my grandfather's." He placed it on the counter, unable to open it himself. Margaret pulled the drawstring and tipped the contents into her palm. A silver star, one of the military's highest decorations for valor, slid out, its surface dulled by decades, but still unmistakable. "My grandfather served in World War II." Eric explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's the only thing of his I have left." Margaret turned the medal over carefully. "You understand what this is, what it represents?" Eric nodded, not trusting his voice. His grandfather, James, had rarely spoken about the war, but on quiet evenings would sometimes share fragments of stories. "He never wanted to be called a hero," Eric finally said. "He kept this medal because of one night nobody expected. He used to say, 'I never knew what he meant.'" Margaret held the medal up to the light, examining it closer. "There's an inscription on the back." "Yes, his name and the year. J.R. Walker, 1944. Margaret's fingers froze. She stared at the engraving, her face suddenly drained of color. "J. Walker," she repeated, her voice strange and distant. "James Robert Walker." Eric's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, that was his name. How did you?" Without another word, Margaret clutched the medal and hurried through a door behind the counter. Disappearing into the back of the shop, Eric stood frozen, confusion washing over him. Had he done something wrong? Was the medal stolen property somehow? His grandfather had died 15 years ago, taking most of his secrets with him. Through the thin walls, Eric heard drawers opening and closing, boxes being moved. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He considered leaving. Maybe this had been a mistake. Just as he turned toward the door, Margaret Ray emerged, her eyes red-rimmed, holding a small wooden box and a framed black and white photograph. Her hands shook as she placed the photograph on the counter, turning it to face Eric. "Is this him?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Is this your grandfather?" Eric leaned closer. The photograph showed a young American soldier, no more than 20, smiling awkwardly next to a small girl of perhaps 10 years old. They stood before a half-destroyed stone building, the girl clutching a worn teddy bear. The soldier was unmistakably his grandfather, the same distinctive jawline, the same slight tilt of the head when smiling. Eric had seen other wartime photos, but never this one. Yes, he breathed. That's him. But who's the little girl? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That's me, she said. Eric stared at Margaret, then back at the photograph. The small girl with tangled hair and a weary expression bore no resemblance to the dignified older woman before him. I don't understand. He finally managed. Margaret carefully placed the medal on a velvet cloth. Neither did I. Until I saw this name. Her fingers brushed the engraving. I never knew his full name, you see. To me, he was just Private Walker. She gestured to a pair of chairs in the corner of the shop. Please sit. This isn't a conversation to have standing. Eric followed, his mind racing. His grandfather had never mentioned saving a little girl. But then, he'd spoken so little. About the war. I was born in a small village near Normandy, Margaret began, her accent suddenly carrying traces of her French origins. In 1944, I was 10 years old when Allied forces began pushing the Germans back through France. She opened the wooden box she'd brought from the back room, removing a child's identity card with a faded photograph. My parents were part of the local resistance. They had been feeding information to the Allies about German positions. Eric leaned forward. His grandfather had been part of the Allied advance through northern France after D-Day. This aligned with the fragments of stories he'd heard growing up. One night in August, German soldiers came to our village looking for resistance members. Margaret continued, her voice growing distant, her eyes focused on memories from 70 years past. They had names, a list. My parents were on it. She paused, collecting herself. Your grandfather was billeted with us. The Americans had liberated our village 3 days earlier. He was part of a communications unit, temporarily stationed there the night the Germans came back. My parents were meeting with other resistance members in the next village. I was home alone with your grandfather. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. He heard them before I did. German voices at our neighbor's house, shouting, then a gunshot. Eric felt a chill despite the warmth of the shop. His grandfather had never spoken of this. He grabbed me from my bed and hid me under the floorboards where my parents kept their radio. Don't make a sound, he told me, no matter what you hear. Margaret's voice broke. For German soldiers broke in minutes later. They demanded to know where my parents were. Your grandfather pretended he couldn't understand them, that he was alone there. They didn't believe him. They started searching. She looked directly at Eric, her eyes suddenly piercing. Do you know what your grandfather did? He created a distraction. He fired his weapon out the back window and yelled that American forces were surrounding the house. Then he ran out the front door. The Germans chased him. I heard more gunshots. I stayed hidden, terrified, for hours. When American soldiers finally found me the next morning, they told me a brave private had alerted them to German infiltrators in the village. He'd been shot twice, but managed to lead the Germans away from the village and into an American patrol. Eric sat stunned. His grandfather had never mentioned being shot, never mentioned saving a child. They awarded him that medal, Margaret said, gesturing to the silver star, not just for bravery in combat, but for saving the lives of resistance, informants, and their families. For saving me, she wiped away a tear. After the war, I tried to find him, to thank him. But all I had was Private Walker and a child's memory of his face. My parents and I immigrated to America in 1950, and the search became impossible. Eric thought of his grandfather, the quiet man who worked as a postal clerk after the war, who never joined veterans groups or marched in parades, who kept a single medal tucked away in a drawer. He never told this story, Eric said softly. Not once. Margaret nodded, unsurprised. The true heroes rarely do. She reached across and took Eric's hand. Young man, I've spent 70 years wondering if he survived the war, wondering if he knew what he did for me. I've owned this shop for 30 years, and I made a promise to myself that if I ever found him or his family, I would repay my debt. Eric shook his head. There's no debt. He was just doing his duty. Margaret interrupted, gently. No, Running into gunfire to save a child goes beyond duty. And now his grandson sits before me, about to sell his medal out of desperation. Her voice hardened with resolve. That I cannot allow. Margaret stood abruptly, leaving Eric sitting alone as she disappeared into the back room once more. He heard a metallic sound, perhaps a safe being opened, and then she returned, holding a thick envelope. I came to this country with nothing, she said, resuming her seat. But I built a life, this business. I've been fortunate. She placed the envelope on the table between them. For 20 years, I've kept a separate account. Do you know what it's for? Eric shook his head, bewildered. When I was 10 years old, lying under those floorboards, I made a promise. If I survived, if I could ever find the soldier who saved me, I would repay him, not just with gratitude, but with everything I could. She slid the envelope toward Eric. This is for you. Eric didn't touch it. I can't accept money for something my grandfather did. It's not for something he did, Margaret corrected. It's for something I promised. This isn't charity, Eric. This is the settling of the oldest debt in my life. When Eric still hesitated, Margaret continued, if our positions were reversed, if your grandfather had saved my child, and decades later you found my grandchild in need, what would you do? The question hung in the air between them. Eric knew the answer. His grandfather, despite his quiet nature, had taught him that responsibility didn't end when the immediate crisis passed. It extended through time to those who came after. I'd help, he admitted softly. Then allow me the same dignity, Margaret said, pushing the envelope closer with trembling fingers. Eric opened it. Inside was more cash than he'd seen in years, along with a handwritten note for the family of Private Walker, with eternal gratitude. This is too much, he protested, his voice cracking. It's 70 years overdue. Margaret replied simply, and it comes with a condition. Eric looked up questioningly. You keep this, she said, carefully wrapping the silver star back in its velvet pouch. It doesn't belong in my shop or anyone else's. It belongs with you. As a reminder of who you come from. Tears welled in Eric's eyes. The weight of his recent failures, the jobs lost, the benefits denied. The mounting bills had made him forget who he was, who his family was. I don't know what to say, he whispered. You don't need to say anything, Margaret assured him. But there is something else I'd like to offer, if you're willing. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a business card. This is the contact information for Veterans United. My late husband was on their board for many years. They help veterans navigate benefit issues, find employment, housing. She smiled. I still have some influence there. One phone call from me, and they'll make sure your case gets proper attention. Eric stared at the card, hope flickering for the first time in months. Why would you do all this? Margaret's expression softened. Because 70 years ago, a young soldier didn't ask why he should save a little French girl. He just did it. She covered his hand with hers. Some debts can never be fully repaid, but we honor them by continuing the chain of kindness. Eric closed his eyes, overwhelmed. When he'd walked into the pawn shop an hour ago, he'd been a man at the end of his rope, about to sell the last connection to his family's past. Now, somehow, that very connection had opened a door to his future. There's one more thing, Margaret said, reaching for the wooden box again. She withdrew a yellowed envelope. After the liberation, American soldiers would sometimes give U.S. children chocolate or gum. Your grandfather gave me this instead. She handed Eric the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in his grandfather's neat penmanship, addressed to the brave little girl. When this war is over, remember that even in the darkest times, good people find each other. Your parents fought for freedom without firing a shot. That kind of courage lasts longer than any battle. Someday, when you're grown, pass that courage to someone else who needs it. That's how we all keep winning, long after the fighting stops. Eric read the words aloud, his voice breaking on the final lines. His grandfather's voice seemed to echo through decades, speaking directly to this moment. I think, Margaret said softly, he would be proud to know his medal helped his grandson when he needed it most. Not by being sold, but by bringing you here. As Eric prepared to leave, Margaret stopped him at the door. Come back next week, she said. Not to my shop, but to my home. She wrote an address on the back of her card. Sunday dinner. I have albums of photos from after the liberation. Perhaps you'd like to see them. Eric nodded, unable to speak through the tightness in his throat. And Eric, she added, bring your resume. My nephew owns a security firm that works with veterans. I think you two should meet. He stepped out into the street, blinking in the sudden sunlight. The rain had stopped, for the first time in months. The weight on his shoulders had lifted. In his pocket was his grandfather's medal, not leaving his family, as he had feared, but instead bringing him an unexpected inheritance, far more valuable than money. He looked back at the shop window, where Margaret stood watching him. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Eric saw in her the shadow of the little girl with the teddy bear, whose life had been saved by a single act of courage 70 years ago. Some circles, it seemed, were meant to be completed. 6 months later, Eric stood before a room of fellow veterans, his grandfather's silver star pinned to his lapel. The conference room at the Veterans Resource Center buzzed with conversation. As he arranged his notes at the podium, if I could have everyone's attention, called the center's director. Today's speaker is Eric Walker, our new Veterans Outreach Coordinator. As many of you know, Eric has been instrumental in developing our Heritage of Courage program. Eric scanned the faces in the audience, smiling when he spotted Margaret in the front row. At 82, she hadn't missed a single one of his presentations. Thank you all for coming, Eric began. 6 months ago, I walked into a pawn shop, ready to sell my grandfather's silver star. I was unemployed, desperate, and had lost sight of who I was. He touched the metal gently. Instead of leaving with cash, I left with something far more valuable, a connection to my grandfather's legacy, and a reminder that our actions echo through generations in ways we can never predict. The Heritage of Courage program had been Eric's idea, a series of workshops connecting struggling veterans with the stories and legacies of those who served before them. It had started small, just a few veterans sharing family military artifacts and the stories behind them. Now it had official backing, grant funding, and a waiting list. Today, we're honored to have a special guest, Eric continued. Many of you have heard me tell the story of how my grandfather saved a young French girl during World War II. That girl, now a distinguished businesswoman in our community, is here today to share her perspective. He gestured toward Margaret. Ms. Margaret Pierce has agreed to tell her story publicly for the first time. Applause filled the room as Margaret made her way to the podium. Though she'd shared her story with Eric's small groups before, this was different, a formal event with community leaders and press in attendance. August 17th, 1944, she began, her voice strong despite her years. I was 10 years old when Private James Walker hid me under floorboards as German soldiers came searching for my parents, who were resistance members. As Margaret recounted the night that had connected their families across decades, Eric watched the audience lean forward in their seats. This wasn't just history. It was living memory, a bridge between past and present. The medal this young man wears, Margaret said, gesturing to Eric, represents not just one act of bravery, but a legacy of service that continues today. Private Walker never sought recognition. He likely never knew his actions that night would echo forward 70 years to save his grandson. In a different kind of dark hour, when she finished, the room erupted in standing applause. Margaret returned to her seat, squeezing Eric's hand as she passed. The program continued with other veterans sharing their own family artifacts, dog tags, letters, photographs, each representing a thread in the larger tapestry of service and sacrifice. Afterward, as people mingled during the reception, a young woman in army dress uniform approached Eric. "Sir," she said, extending her hand. "Private Melissa Hernandez. I ship out next week for my first deployment." "Thank you for your service, Private," Eric replied, shaking her hand. "And please, it's just Eric." She hesitated, then continued. "Your story about your grandfather, it meant a lot to me. I've been nervous about deploying, but hearing how one soldier's actions could matter so much, even decades later," Eric nodded, understanding. "Would you like to see something?" He led her to a small display case near the entrance, where Margaret had loaned several items for exhibition. Among them was a framed letter, his grandfather's note to the brave little girl. My grandfather wrote this, not knowing if it would ever matter, Eric explained. But it did. Just not in the way he expected. Private Hernandez read the letter, her expression solemn. That's beautiful. Eric reached into his pocket and withdrew a small envelope. Ms. Pierce and I have been working on something for the program, a letter-writing initiative. He handed the envelope to Hernandez. This is for you, not to read now, but to take with you. What is it? She asked, turning the sealed envelope in her hands. A letter from my grandfather. In a way, I've transcribed his words and added some of my own. A reminder that what you do matters, even when you can't see how or why. Hernandez's eyes glistened. Thank you. I'll keep it with me. Across the room, Margaret watched the exchange, a satisfied smile on her face. The shop she'd run for 30 years had evolved, too. One corner now featured a small display. James R. Walker, the soldier who never asked to be remembered, but always was. Visitors often asked about the display, giving Margaret the opportunity to share the story and direct veterans to the resources Eric coordinated. The chain of connection continued to expand. Later that evening, as Eric drove Margaret home, she patted the wooden box on her lap, the one she'd brought from her back room 6 months earlier. I've been thinking, she said. This box has held my memories of that night for 70 years. But perhaps it's time for it to have a new purpose. She opened it, revealing additional photographs, her childhood identification papers, and various mementos from post-liberation France. I'd like to donate these to your program, she said. With one condition, Eric replied, name it. That you continue to share not just what my grandfather did for you, but what you've done with his legacy. The medal saved a life long ago. Now it's saved another in a different way. At Margaret's house, before saying good night, Eric noticed a new photograph on her mantel, him standing proudly in his new office at the Veterans Center, his grandfather's medal visible on his lapel. Next to it stood an even newer addition, a group photo from the previous week's Heritage of Courage workshop, showing veterans of different eras sharing their stories, connected by threads of understanding that transcended time and circumstance. You know, Margaret said, following his gaze. When I made that promise as a child hiding under the floorboards, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Eric smiled. My grandfather used to say that heroism isn't about being remembered. It's about doing right by others, even when no one is watching. He was wise, Margaret nodded. But I think he'd be pleased to know he is remembered, not just for what he did, but for the ripples his actions created. As Eric left, he touched the silver star pin on his jacket. It was no longer just a medal or even just a memory. It had become a beacon, guiding him forward while honoring the path behind. There are heroes who don't need their names remembered, but those who keep such memories alive. They are the ones who make history. I don't want anyone to be left behind. Everyone deserves to be heard and respected. If you believe that too, comment respect to show you stand for kindness and justice.